Everyone in the diner went silent when the little girl's voice rang out like a bell, clear, innocent, and impossibly loud. "Daddy, why is that lady crying into the dishwater?" Ethan Parker's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was pointing toward the kitchen's service window, where a young waitress stood with her back to the dining room, shoulders trembling. The woman's hands were submerged in gray, soapy water, but even from across the room, Ethan could see she was struggling to hold herself together. "Lily, don't point," Ethan whispered, gently lowering his daughter's hand. But it was too late. Half the diner had already turned to look, including the man in the expensive suit sitting 3 booths away, a local real estate developer named Richard Moss, whose face twisted into something ugly when he recognized the waitress. "Well, well," Richard announced, his voice dripping with contempt. "Grace Sullivan. Washing dishes now, are we? How the mighty have fallen." The waitress, Grace, turned slowly, her face pale and drawn. She couldn't have been older than 30, but exhaustion had carved years into her features. Her uniform was clean but worn thin at the elbows, and her name tag was slightly crooked. When her eyes met Richard's, something inside her seemed to crumble. "I'm just trying to work, Richard," she said quietly. "Work?" Richard laughed, and it was a cruel sound. "Your family used to own half this town. Now you're scrubbing plates at Murphy's Diner. I heard about your father's little scandal, embezzlement, wasn't it? Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Tell me, Grace, did you know what he was doing? Did you spend any of that stolen money on those designer clothes you used to parade around in?" Grace's hands were shaking now. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The other diners looked away, embarrassed witnesses to someone else's humiliation. The owner, an older woman named Helen, stepped forward uncertainly, but Richard wasn't finished. "My firm bought your family's estate for pennies on the dollar," he continued, standing now, enjoying his moment. "Every time I walk through those rooms, I think about how fitting it is. People like your father, people like you, always think you're above everyone else. Always think the rules don't apply. Well, look at you now." That's when Ethan stood up. He didn't plan it. Didn't think about it. He'd spent the last 3 years since his wife's death learning to keep his head down, to focus only on Lily, to avoid conflict. But something in Grace's eyes, a desperate, drowning look he recognized too well, pulled him to his feet. "That's enough," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. Richard turned, sizing up the stranger in the worn construction jacket and paint-stained jeans. "Excuse me?" "I said that's enough." Ethan placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "You've made your point. And who the hell are you?" "Nobody important," Ethan replied. "Just a guy who remembers what it's like when the whole world decides your story before you get to tell it." The diner held its breath. Richard's face flushed red, his jaw working as he searched for a response. But Ethan wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at Grace, whose eyes had filled with tears she refused to let fall. And in that moment, neither of them knew that this chance encounter would unravel secrets that would change everything, for both of them. Because Grace Sullivan wasn't just a fallen heiress washing dishes. She was the rightful owner of a billion-dollar empire, stolen from her by the very man who'd destroyed her father's name. And she'd been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the one person brave enough to see her truth. Ethan didn't go back to work that afternoon. He told himself it was because Lily had a dentist appointment, but that wasn't until Thursday. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He couldn't stop thinking about the look in Grace's eyes when Richard Moss had torn into her. It was the same look he'd seen in his own mirror for 2 years after Sarah died, the look of someone barely holding on. "Daddy, you're quiet," Lily said from the passenger seat of his truck, her small feet swinging above the floorboard. "Just thinking, sweetheart." "About the sad lady?" Ethan glanced at his daughter. At 7 years old, Lily had already developed an unsettling ability to read him. "Yeah, about the sad lady. She wasn't crying because she's bad, was she? Even though that mean man said she was? No, baby. She wasn't crying because she's bad." Ethan pulled into their driveway, a small rental house with a yard that desperately needed mowing. Sometimes people get blamed for things they didn't do. And sometimes the weight of that blame gets so heavy, they don't know how to carry it anymore. Lily considered this with the seriousness only children can muster. Like when Tommy Brennan said I pushed him, but really he tripped. Exactly like that. Except imagine if the whole school believed Tommy, and no one listened to your side. That would be terrible. "Yes," Ethan said softly. "It would be." That evening, after Lily was asleep, Ethan did something he hadn't done in months. He opened his laptop and searched for information about Grace Sullivan. The articles painted a damning picture. Her father, James Sullivan, had been the CEO of Sullivan Properties, a commercial real estate empire worth over $1 billion. 2 years ago, federal investigators discovered a massive embezzlement scheme, $47 million siphoned from company accounts into offshore holdings. James Sullivan had died of a heart attack before the trial concluded, leaving his daughter to face the public crucifixion alone. But as Ethan read deeper, something didn't sit right. The evidence seemed almost too perfect. Every digital trail led back to James Sullivan, but there were whispers in the comment sections, conspiracy theories, maybe, but persistent ones, about Richard Moss's company acquiring Sullivan Properties immediately after the scandal broke. About how convenient it was that Moss's firm had been the one to discover the embezzlement during a routine audit they'd been hired to conduct. Ethan closed the laptop, his mind churning. He knew something about being judged by a story you couldn't control. After Sarah's death, well-meaning neighbors had whispered about whether he could really raise Lily alone. Whether a construction worker with rough hands and a high school education was enough for a little girl who'd just lost her mother. He'd heard the whispers, seen the pitying looks. He'd proven them all wrong. Maybe Grace deserved the same chance. The next morning, Ethan found himself back at Murphy's diner, this time alone. Grace was wiping down tables, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone trying to stay invisible. She looked up when the bell chimed, and for a split second, recognition flickered across her face. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice professionally neutral. "Actually, I wanted to apologize," Ethan said. "For yesterday. I shouldn't have inserted myself into your business like that." Grace's hand stilled on the table she was cleaning. "You don't need to apologize. You were kind. That's more than most people have been. Still, it wasn't my place." She studied him with eyes that were startlingly green in the morning light. "You said something yesterday, about the world deciding your story before you get to tell it. What did you mean?" Ethan hesitated. He hadn't talked about Sarah with anyone except Lily's counselor in over a year. But something about Grace's direct gaze, the way she wasn't asking out of curiosity but genuine understanding, made him answer honestly. "My wife died 3 years ago. Car accident. For a while, everyone in this town looked at me like I was a tragedy in progress, like I was inevitably going to fail, to let my daughter down. I got tired of being someone else's cautionary tale." Grace's expression softened. "I'm sorry. That must have been unbearable." "It was. But I figured out something important. The only story that matters is the one you tell yourself. Everyone else's version is just noise." For the first time since he'd met her, Grace smiled. It was small, fragile as spun glass, but real. "That's a nice philosophy. I'm not sure I believe it yet, but it's nice." "Give it time," Ethan said. Then, because he was either brave or foolish. "And if you ever need someone to remind you that your story isn't finished yet, someone who won't judge you for the chapters you didn't write, I'm usually here around 7 a.m. with my daughter. She asks a lot of questions, but she's a good listener." Grace looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "I'll remember that." As Ethan left, he didn't see Richard Moss sitting in a car across the street, watching through tinted windows with a phone pressed to his ear. "She's talking to someone," Richard said. "Find out who he is. I want to know everything about him by tonight." Because Richard Moss hadn't destroyed the Sullivan Empire just to watch Grace rebuild a life, any life, in his town. 3 days later, Ethan brought Lily back to the diner for pancakes. Grace was working the morning shift, and when she saw them come in, that fragile smile appeared again. Lily waved enthusiastically, and Grace waved back, her movements a little less mechanical than before. "Can we sit at our section?" Lily whispered loudly. "I think that can be arranged," Ethan said, guiding his daughter to a booth near the window. Grace appeared with menus and a knowing look. "Pancakes with extra whipped cream?" Lily's eyes went wide. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Grace said, but she was looking at Ethan when she said it, and he felt something warm unfold in his chest. Something he hadn't felt since Sarah, something he wasn't sure he was ready for but couldn't quite push away. They were halfway through breakfast when the bell chimed and an older man walked in. He wore a military jacket despite the summer heat, and a thick scar ran from his temple to his jaw. Ethan recognized him immediately. Everyone in town knew Cole Mitchell, the Marine veteran who lived alone on the outskirts and rarely spoke to anyone. Cole took a seat at the counter, and Grace approached with coffee. But as she poured, her hands trembled, and hot coffee splashed across the counter, dangerously close to Cole's arm. "I'm so sorry," Grace gasped, grabbing napkins. "I'm so sorry It's fine, Cole said gruffly. No harm done. But Grace's breathing had gone rapid and shallow. She was staring at the spilled coffee like it was blood, her face draining of color. Ethan recognized a panic attack when he saw one. He'd had enough of them in the months after Sarah died. He stood up. Lily, stay here for a minute, okay? But Daddy. Just a minute. Ethan approached the counter just as Helen emerged from the kitchen. Grace, you all right? I'm fine, Grace said, but her voice cracked. I just need a minute. I'm sorry Take a break, Helen said gently. Go sit in the back. Grace fled toward the kitchen, and Ethan found himself following, aware that he was probably crossing a line but unable to stop himself. He found her in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the storage room, her back against the wall, gasping for air. Hey, Ethan said softly. Grace. Look at me. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I know how this feels, Ethan continued, keeping his voice calm. The world shrinking down to nothing but your heartbeat and the fear. I know, but you're safe. You're here. Just breathe with me, okay? In through your nose, out through your mouth. Slowly, painfully, Grace's breathing began to steady. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were red and devastated. I spilled coffee, she whispered. I spilled coffee and I fell apart. What's wrong with me? Nothing's wrong with you, Ethan said firmly. You're carrying more than anyone should have to carry alone. That's not weakness. That's just human. Grace let out a shaky laugh. You don't know what I'm carrying. So tell me. The words hung between them. In the kitchen, pots clanged. In the dining room, Lily was probably wondering where her father had gone. But in that narrow hallway, time felt suspended. I can't, Grace finally said. It's too dangerous. Dangerous how? Before she could answer, Cole Mitchell appeared in the doorway. Up close, his scarred face was even more intimidating, but his eyes were surprisingly gentle. You okay, miss? He asked Grace. I'm fine, Grace said quickly. I'm sorry about the coffee. Forget the coffee. Cole's gaze shifted between Grace and Ethan, assessing. Then he said something that changed everything. I was at your father's funeral, Miss Sullivan. Stood in the back. Didn't think you saw me. Grace went very still. You knew my father? Not well, but I knew Richard Moss. Served with his brother in Afghanistan. Cole's jaw tightened. His brother was a good man. Richard isn't. And I've watched him destroy a lot of lives since I got back stateside, including yours. Why are you telling me this? Grace breathed. Because I've been where you are. Rock bottom, everyone thinking they know your story, nowhere to go but down. Cole looked at Ethan. And because this man just risked pissing off his daughter to make sure you were okay. That tells me something about his character. You need allies, Miss Sullivan. Moss doesn't play fair, and he doesn't stop. Ethan felt like he'd walked into the middle of a movie. Someone want to fill me in? Grace and Cole exchanged a look. Then Grace made a decision that would either save her life or end it. Not here, she said quietly. But if you really want to know what I'm carrying, meet me at Riverside Park tonight. 9 o'clock. Come alone. Ethan almost didn't go. He stood in his kitchen at 8:45 p.m., keys in hand, while Lily's babysitter, Mrs. Chun from next door, worked on a crossword puzzle in the living room. Every rational part of his brain screamed that this was a mistake. He didn't know Grace Sullivan beyond 2 conversations and a panic attack. He had a daughter to think about. Getting involved in whatever web Richard Moss had spun could only end badly. But he remembered Grace's eyes. The desperation. The hope. I'll be back by 10, he told Mrs. Chin. Riverside Park was empty at night, the playground equipment casting long shadows under weak streetlights. Grace was sitting on a bench near the river, wearing jeans and a hoodie that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her waitress uniform ever did. When she saw Ethan, relief washed over her face. You came. I almost didn't, Ethan admitted, sitting beside her. This feels like the beginning of a very complicated situation. It is. Grace pulled her hoodie tighter. My father didn't embezzle that money, Ethan. Richard Moss did. He set my father up, falsified records, created a digital trail that led investigators straight to my dad's accounts. And when my father figured it out and threatened to expose him, Moss made sure the stress triggered his heart attack. The words tumbled out, 3 years of silence breaking like a dam. Ethan listened as Grace explained how her father had hired Moss's firm to modernize Sullivan Properties' accounting systems. How Moss had used that access to systematically drain accounts while simultaneously building evidence that pointed to James Sullivan. How her father had confided his suspicions to Grace the week before he died, begging her to stay quiet until he could gather proof. But he died before he could, Grace said, her voice breaking. And everyone believed the evidence. The FBI, the media, the business partners who'd worked with my father for 30 years. Everyone. Moss bought Sullivan Properties for a fraction of its value, and I was left with nothing but debt and my father's ruined name. Why didn't you fight? Ethan asked. If you knew the truth. With what? Grace laughed bitterly. Moss destroyed the evidence. And without my father's testimony, it was my word against a digital trail that painted my father as a master criminal. I tried, Ethan. I hired lawyers, investigators. But Moss has connections, powerful people who owed him favors. Every lead dried up. Every witness suddenly couldn't remember anything. After 2 years, I had to accept that I couldn't win. So you became invisible. I became a ghost in my own life. Working minimum wage jobs, moving from town to town. I came back here 6 months ago because, I don't know, maybe because this is where my father built his life, and I couldn't let Moss erase him completely. She turned to face Ethan. But 3 days ago, something changed. What? Cole Mitchell. He approached me after my shift yesterday. Told me his brother, Richard's brother, Marcus Moss, contacted him from overseas before he died. Sent him a package. Inside were financial records, encrypted files, evidence that Marcus had discovered Richard's scheme. Marcus felt guilty about his brother's crimes, wanted to make it right. But he died in action before he could use it. Ethan's heart was pounding. Cole has proof. He has everything. Bank transfers, falsified documents, even emails where Richard discusses the setup with his accomplices. Cole's been sitting on it for a year, trying to figure out what to do with it. He's not good with people anymore. The war changed him. But when he saw you stand up to Richard for me, saw someone who actually gave a damn about whether I was okay, he decided it was time to act. Grace, if you have evidence, Moss will kill me before I can use it. The words were flat, factual. He's already made sure I have no credibility. If I go public with this, he'll bury me. He'll say I'm a desperate woman inventing conspiracy theories to salvage my family name. And without someone people trust, someone with no connection to the Sullivan legacy, someone who can verify the evidence independently. She trailed off, her meaning clear. You want my help, Ethan said slowly. I want someone who believes me. Someone Richard Moss hasn't gotten to yet. Someone who, Grace's voice caught. Someone who sees me as a person, not a fallen heiress or a criminal's daughter. Just a person who deserves the truth. Ethan thought about Lily, about the life he'd carefully rebuilt after Sarah died. Getting involved meant risking everything. Moss clearly had power, connections, and no conscience. But he also thought about Grace washing dishes in a diner, her hands trembling. About the look in her eyes when Richard had humiliated her. About the story no one would let her tell. What do you need me to do? He asked. The relief on Grace's face was so profound it hurt to witness. Just trust me. Just don't walk away when this gets hard. Because it's going to get very hard. I've done hard before, Ethan said. I can do it again. They sat in silence for a moment, the river flowing past them in the darkness. Then Grace did something unexpected. She reached out and took his hand. Her palm was warm and calloused from work, and her fingers trembled slightly. Thank you, she whispered. For seeing me. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. Someone once told me the only story that matters is the one you tell yourself. But sometimes we need someone else to remind us we're worth telling a story about it all. Neither of them saw the car idling across the street, its headlights off, or the camera lens pointed at them through a rolled-down window, capturing their joined hands in the lamplight. Richard Moss had made a career of destroying people who threatened him, and he was just getting started. The photographs arrived at Ethan's job site the next morning. His foreman, Danny, handed them over with a troubled expression. These were taped to your truck, man. I don't know what you're mixed up in, but... Ethan's blood went cold. The photos showed him and Grace at the park, hands joined, faces close. Across the images, someone had written in red marker, "Stay away from her or your daughter pays." He called Grace immediately. "We need to meet. Now." They gathered at Cole's place, a small cabin surrounded by woods that felt both remote and defensible. Cole answered the door with a shotgun, but lowered it when he saw who it was. "Moss knows," Ethan said without preamble, showing them the photos. Grace's face went white. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I never should have involved you." "Too late for that." Ethan's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Now we need to figure out how to finish this before Moss makes good on his threats." Cole set the shotgun aside. Then it's time to move. I've got the evidence secured, copies in 3 different locations, including with a lawyer who knows to release everything if something happens to any of us. But we need more than evidence. We need leverage. What kind of leverage? Grace asked. The kind that makes Moss more afraid of exposure than he is confident in his power. Cole pulled out a laptop, his scarred hands surprisingly nimble on the keyboard. Marcus's files don't just prove what Moss did to your father. They prove he's been running the same scam on at least 5 other companies. There are people out there, powerful people, who've lost everything because of him. People who'd testify if they knew they weren't alone. Ethan felt a plan forming. We need to contact them. Build a coalition. Make this bigger than one family's vendetta. For the next 3 days, they worked in secret. Cole used his military contacts to track down Moss's other victims. Grace drafted detailed timelines, cross-referencing Marcus's evidence with public records. Ethan, whose construction company had built relationships with half the town's business owners, quietly spread the word that something big was coming, something that would expose corruption at the highest levels. But Moss wasn't idle. On the 4th day, Child Protective Services showed up at Ethan's door with an anonymous complaint about neglect. On the 5th day, Grace was fired from the diner after Richard Moss bought the property and made Helen an offer she couldn't refuse. On the 6th day, Cole's cabin was broken into, though nothing was taken, just a message that they were being watched. He's trying to break us before we can act, Grace said, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. They were back at Cole's cabin, working by laptop light. He's going to keep escalating until we go public, Ethan interrupted. Tonight, we've contacted 8 of his victims. 6 have agreed to come forward. That's enough. It's not enough to guarantee he goes to prison, Cole warned. Rich men don't go to prison easy. No, Ethan agreed. But it's enough to destroy his reputation. To make him radioactive to every business partner and politician he's cultivated. To take away his power. Grace looked between them. And if he comes after us anyway? Then we make sure the whole world is watching when he does, Ethan said. We don't just release the evidence. We tell the story. Your father's story. Your story. The story of every person Moss destroyed. We make it impossible for anyone to look away. They worked through the night, crafting a press release, organizing evidence, coordinating with the victims who'd agreed to go public. At dawn, they sent everything to 3 major newspapers, 2 TV stations, and a dozen online journalists simultaneously. By noon, the story was everywhere. By evening, federal investigators had announced a new inquiry into Sullivan Properties and Richard Moss's business dealings. By the next morning, Richard Moss was in FBI custody. 2 months later, Ethan found Grace standing in front of what used to be her father's estate. The sold sign had been replaced with a construction notice. The property was being converted into a community center, funded by the settlement Grace had received when additional evidence forced Moss's associates to return assets to Sullivan Properties. You didn't have to give it away, Ethan said, coming to stand beside her. Lily was at school, but she'd made Grace promise to come to her dance recital that evening. Yes, I did. Grace's voice was peaceful in a way Ethan had never heard before. My father built his empire to give back to this community. Moss turned it into something ugly. This way, it becomes what it was always meant to be. And what will you do? Grace turned to look at him, and in the sunlight, her green eyes were clear and bright. I'm going to rebuild Sullivan Properties the right way. Small at first. Honest. And I'm going to need good people around me. People who see the truth even when it's buried under lies. I might know a construction worker who fits that description, Ethan said, a smile tugging at his lips. I was hoping you'd say that. Grace took his hand, the gesture as natural as breathing now. And maybe, when we're not busy rebuilding empires and raising daughters and testifying against criminals, maybe we could have dinner? Just the 3 of us? Ethan thought about Sarah, about the grief he'd carried for so long. And he realized that loving again didn't mean forgetting. It meant honoring what he'd lost by choosing to live fully anyway. I'd like that, he said. Lily would too. She's already decided you're her hero, you know. She tells everyone about the brave lady who fought the bad man and won. Grace laughed, and it was a sound of pure joy. I didn't win alone. No, Ethan agreed. You didn't. They stood together in front of the estate, 2 people who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control, now building something new from the pieces. Cole had found purpose helping other veterans navigate the VA system. Grace had reclaimed her family's legacy. Ethan had learned that protecting your heart doesn't mean closing it. And sometimes, the heroes don't announce themselves with grand gestures. Sometimes, they're just ordinary people who decide that someone else's story matters. That dignity matters. That truth, no matter how deeply buried, is worth fighting for. As they walked away from the estate, Grace's hand warm in his, Ethan thought about the diner, about the moment he'd stood up to Richard Moss without knowing where it would lead, about the choice to see someone, really see them, when the whole world was determined to look away. "Thank you," Grace said softly, "for seeing me when I was invisible." Ethan squeezed her hand. "Thank you for reminding me that my story wasn't finished either." Behind them, the estate stood waiting for its transformation. Ahead of them, a little girl was waiting to show her father and her new friend her dance routine. And somewhere in between the past and the future, 3 broken people had found each other and built something worth believing in. Sometimes, that's all the redemption anyone needs.